A very good evening and welcome back to Bharat Varta. My name is Sharan Setty and I'll be the host for this particular podcast with Dr. Hindol Sengupta, who we've had the pleasure of having a conversation with over his last book as well. A little introduction before we say hi. He is obviously an author and a very well known historian. He's won many awards for the works that he's written. But talking about the specific book that we're going to discuss, it's called Soul and Sword, and it's published by Penguin Random House India. And this book traces the journey of political Hinduism from the events that are very critical to its self narration. That is, early Indian resistance to invasions, to intellectual definitions by the 19th century thought leaders, and more contemporary electoral politics. It tries to understand context and historical sources are used to construct and promote political Hinduism's worldview, and it's written by Dr. Sengupta. And this makes for an absolutely critical reading to understand India's present and the future. Dr. Sengupta, thank you so much for joining us. Namaste and welcome to Bharat Varta once again.
Namaste, Sharan. A delight meeting you once again. I remember fondly our great conversation in Bangalore on my last book, Sing, Dance, and Pray, and it's a delight to join you once
No, the
again.
pleasure is absolutely ours. I will throw the ball to your court and ask you to introduce the book to our audience. And based on that, I'll have several questions, I'm sure.
So I think you did a great job in introducing the book. As you correctly point out, Soul and Sword is the first definitive intellectual history of political Hinduism. Now, many people talk about political Hinduism in terms of the word Hindutva in India. In my understanding, that is only part of the story, an important part, but a part of the story, because the self narration of political Hinduism stretches far beyond the time when Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay first used the word Hindutva in Anandamath. In fact, one of the early interventions that my book makes is by telling people that it wasn't Chandranath Basu or Veer Savarkar, for that matter, who came up with the word Hindutva. It was actually Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay in a seminal book, because, of course, as you know, Anandamath gave India its national song, Vande Mataram, an anthem for revolutionaries as they marched cheerfully to the British gallows, sacrificing their life for the freedom of India. Now, this is the book that first wrote or first mentioned the word Hindutva. Um, I guess because we don't have very large numbers of Bengali speakers or readers, particularly who engage with issues like this fact has remained hidden for a very long time. But we should now, with my book, start giving Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay and Anandamath due credit for the use of this first use of this word. Also, of course, you would understand, Sharan, this means a very interesting thing is happening, right? Usually, as I mentioned in my book, in contemporary political polemic, political Hinduism is considered a sort of as the English would say, a Johnny come lately, so to speak, right? Something that's new, something that's perhaps not even fully formed
Yeah.
as an ideology, something that's still rudimentary, and so on and so forth. However, if Bankim was the first person to mention it all those years ago, in Anandamath, that means that the conceptualization of political Hinduism goes back at the very least to the very heart of India's national movement for freedom. So therefore, the question that let's bring that down to contemporary politics. I think there is no reason, therefore, to argue that somehow political Hinduism as an ideological concept or framework is in any sense new. In fact, as I mentioned in my book, political Hinduism actually perhaps outstrips, as far as history is concerned, and as far as time is concerned, any other manifestations of India's national movement. Because clearly the sort of Nehruvian consensus was, of course, much later. In fact, even the Gandhian consensus came much later. Political Hinduism, in a sense, is almost a parental concept of India's national movement and India's nationalism. Both Gandhi's conceptualization of India's nationalism and, of course, later Nehru's conceptualization of India's nationalism came much later. Therefore, it is in that sense seminal in many ways. You will remember that in Anandamath, the book, the heroes of that book are warrior monks who are fighting this battle from the forests, right? And therefore, soul and sword, the idea of soul, which is of course deep
Hmm.
spirituality, and sword, which is a sense of revolutionary fervor and warriordom, so to speak, is deeply intertwined in the story, and therefore soul and sword. So I think the first thing to remember about political Hinduism is that it is probably a pioneering idea of Indian nationalism and not something newfangled which has just popped up, so
Of
to speak.
the of the three questions that I have on the top of my mind, the first question and naturally would be, what is the difference between the Savarkar version of Hindutva that we today see? Perhaps even there is an political attempt to codify it to a large extent of what Hindutva means even today. How would that be different from the Bengali version that you say originated a few years earlier?
I think many of the questions that Savarkar asked are similar because at the end of the day, people like Chandranath Basu or Bankim or later, people like Aurobindo, what are the questions they are asking? I think there are three or four fundamental questions they're asking. Every nation has an essence that defines its nationhood, right? That essence is a combination of culture, society, norms, ethics, morals, worldview, looking at the world. And many of these things, because many of these things, worldview, ethics, morals, are in many ways derivative of religion. Therefore, faith plays a very important role. I mean, there's a reason why in America they say, in God we trust. When they say, in God we trust, well, the question to ask is, which God do they mean? Do they mean Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh? Do they mean, Jehovah? I mean,
Yeah,
which God do they mean? Of course, the God they mean is the Christian God because of America's conceptualization as a Christian nation. Now, the moment you say this, in India, this becomes controversial immediately because people say, well, then it cuts away all the people who are not Hindu. Now, that actually is a fundamental mistake because remember, America, because it says it's a Christian nation, does not discriminate. In fact, the world's largest contemporary Hindu temple has just been built in
yeah,
Robbinsville in America, right? So that every American president has to clearly define themselves as Christian before they can become president has not stopped America from allowing, the world's largest contemporary Hindu temple to be built
right.
in America. So these two things are not opposed to one another. India can remain culturally and draw its roots culturally from Hinduism, as it were. Well, I don't know whether the ism, again,
Yeah,
there's a debate where Hinduism is the right word, but let's just say Hindu conceptions of nationhood, and yet remain fully a plural, a nation in every aspect. After all, that was Savarkar's argument too, that this cultural heritage is not just meant for people who consider themselves, as far as religion is concerned, Hindu, but it is a common heritage that everybody shares. And that's certainly true, I would think. So, therefore, this part should become not controversial soon. I don't know why it's still controversial. I think every sensible person looking at India would say that India must retain its pluralism. It's a very vital thing as far as India is concerned. After all, it's a country of so many different sort of, subsects of people, languages, and food, and all kinds of things, and microcultures. Therefore, India's pluralism is a vital life force for it. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that this pluralism exists in a sense by drawing sustenance from a spiritual core, so to speak, which has inherent Hindu roots. Now, I at least don't think that this is controversial at all. I am a big believer in India's pluralism, and I don't think this is a dichotomy or controversial. Do people discriminate on such basis? But human beings are, imperfect creatures, Sharan. We discriminate on all kinds of
Hmm.
things. On language, on clothes, we discriminate on who went to which school, who went to which college. There is no end to human
Yeah.
discrimination, right? Just because some human beings are shallow enough to discriminate does not and should not take away from what is our integral cultural identity. Now, let me make one more point here,
Hmm.
if you allow me. Some people at this point in time would say, well, what about other things that came out of Bengal, like
Yeah.
Tagore's humanism, right? And I hear this all the time, Tagore's secular humanism and so on and so forth. And that's perfectly fine. But a lot of people who talk about Tagore's secular humanism, and of course the Brahmo Samaj and so on and so forth, forget that both the Brahmos and of course Tagore, who was part of that universe, derived this entire idea of humanism not from ether. They didn't imagine it up, right? It was not like a
Yeah.
fantasy idea in their head. They of course derived it entirely from
Mm.
Upanishadic knowledge, from Vedic and Upanishadic knowledge. Because after all, if you look at the Brahmo conceptualization of the universe, it is nothing. It is merely keeping away all the sort of ritualistic
Hmm.
framework of Hinduism and embracing the Upanishadic worldview, so to speak. I was just telling somebody, because I'm working on a new book on the Ashtavakra Gita with Dr. Vivek Debroy, and I was talking to somebody about this, and that this entire Brahmo and Tagore's conceptualization of humanism, essentially it is like the Ashtavakra Gita. It has kept away all the the Puranas and perhaps even the Bhagavad Gita with its stories and lore and fables and rituals and all kinds of things. It sort of is a distilled format, so to speak. So Tagore's humanism didn't come from the West. Tagore's humanism didn't come from the sky or the heavens. Tagore's humanism was really a derivative of this Brahmo Samaj idea of going back to the Upanishadic core. You'll realize, even as I'm saying this obviously is reminding you completely of what Swami Vivekananda said. Because Swami Vivekananda's conceptualization was exactly this, because he too was part of that universe of the Bengal Renaissance, so on and so forth. Swami Vivekananda, as he went deeper and deeper, also at the same time embraced the sort of
Right.
bhakti aspects of his master Ramakrishna Paramhans, and that of course happens later. And then he embraces this idea of Kali worship and so on and so forth, Ma Kali, and so on and so forth. But I'm just trying to explain that this idea that, oh, all these people who spoke about secularism or pluralism or humanism somehow
Yeah.
were cut away from this Hindu root. That's not correct. I mean, after all, even Gandhi basically said that all his ideas, in many senses, the moral core of his ideas came from the
Mm.
Bhagavad Gita. I mean, which is why people like Arundhati Roy and many other hard left people
Hmm.
don't like Gandhi, because you must, if you can diminish and destroy Gandhi, then you have diminished and destroyed a core pillar of a person who is revered around the world and yet called himself
Right.
Hindu. You see, so what we're doing is we're going into all these
Yeah.
layers that exist in our society to come to the fundamental point that in the Soul and Sword, I explain that, look, this cultural heritage, and there is no running away from the fact that it comes from a Hindu core, was used by many people. And that is the reason, in spite of bans and this, that, and the other, and the hard secular left and others, anglicized left trying to
Right.
erase it in India, it was never possible, because you cannot erase the core of a civilization, and the core of our civilization
What
comes
you're
from this
essentially
place.
trying to say is that the core of all the interpretations today that we may have, that manifests itself in the form of different cultures and different interpretations that we may have in cultures that vary from region to region and state to state, almost synchronize in a very harmonious manner and not in a very destructive manner. where you see in certain religious texts, interpretations are the root cause of all evils today in the form of several uh, terrorism and different other issues that we see in the world today. My question to you would be, if I can slightly connect this to politics, perhaps is this the reason the differences that we have within, whether it's unhealthy or not healthy, or healthy, is an entirely different debate altogether? Is it perhaps why parties that bank on Hindutva, especially the BJP, is not able to penetrate certain states, especially Bengal, where there was a renaissance, uh, and there was nationalism which was born, a century or two ago?
Look, I mean, there is many kinds of analysis of why the BJP has not or was not able to win in Bengal in the last assembly elections, or hasn't been able to penetrate it in a way as far as winning elections is concerned, as you say. Now, there are far more prosaic reasons, and we don't have time at the moment to go into those because that'll go into the
Sure.
realm of psephology, and I'm certainly no psephologist, so I would not claim that. But there were many prosaic reasons of, the wrong people doing the wrong things at the wrong place and
Right.
all kinds of things, right? And there's a whole litany of things that we need to go into. However, I want to point out that no matter what other people say or do, and no matter the fact that, Bengal has this whole, sort of uber left history and so on and so forth, at least in the recent past, what is the single biggest cultural attribute which has now also become one of the most significant economic attributes of contemporary Bengal? It is the Durga Puja. You cannot run away from it. No amount of calling it Sharad Utsav and autumnal fest and this, that, and the other cannot take away from the fact that it is Durga Puja.
Right.
No matter how many hard left people come in, and no matter how many Islamists come in, and this, that, and the other, in fact, even the Islamists in Calcutta finally become patrons of Durga Puja. Now, whether that's necessarily good or bad, that's another question. But I'm just saying it has become, no matter who has come to power, the most important cultural heritage and treasure of Bengal, something that has become now a global, cultural heritage, right? There's no running away. I mean, Durga Puja in Bengal is like Christmas, right? And Durga Puja now is like around the world.
Yeah.
It's no longer confined even to Bengal or India. So there is no running away. This is my point. You see, no matter who says what, and no matter how hard left or whatever people are, finally, few Indians can run away from the fact that this spiritual core and this cultural heritage lies at the very heart of understanding Bharat. That Bharat, as Swami Vivekananda famously said, cannot exist until people understand this fundamental core of Bharat. Now, political Hinduism is only a political manifestation of this idea, but this spiritual core is essential to us. And if people are not prejudiced, this spiritual core is available to everyone. Yoga doesn't say that you have to, bow before this deity to embrace yoga, right? Now, of course, once you enter the yogic framework, then there are obviously many things that comes with entering the yogic framework, because you enter a universe. Yoga is not just a bunch of exercise routines. You enter a yogic frame of mind that has, many manifestations, but this is available to everybody. That's the core point. It is fundamentally an inclusive heritage that's available to everybody. That is why, and here's the point, and you've heard this said many times, but it bears
Hmm.
repeating. Indian civilization is the only civilization that survived hundreds of years of invasions, that could not be conquered, could not be converted, and hard left revolution like in China could not be brought to it. We are the single most important, in fact, perhaps the sole such civilization. That we are 1.4 billion people makes us impossible to avoid. If we were a tiny bunch of people of 10 million people, I don't think too many people would have cared. But we are 1.4 billion people. And we must never forget that there must be something unique to us that we could not be conquered, could not be colonized entirely, I mean, right? Could not be converted, and Marxist revolution could not be brought
Right.
at scale. Obviously, there are parts, put Kerala, Bengal, this, that, and the other. At scale, could never happen in India. India always retained its essence, and that essence goes to the heart of political Hinduism. It's the core argument of political Hinduism. It is that India exists because of this cultural
What would you
essence.
say is the role of technology and the future of our civilization, especially because we've been able to better so many lives over the years because of the kind of things that we've been able to integrate into daily governance aspects? Today, there's an effort to clean the Ganga, and we are attempting to restore a certain civilization that once was very glorious but was wounded as a matter of as an occurrence of several invasions and colonialism. But what holds for us in the future? Do you touch upon these aspects in the book, or generally, as somebody who is so well read, do you wonder what would happen in the future? Because obviously, it's all black and white in a manner of speaking. Because technology can be harmful, because people are drawing themselves away from spirituality to a large extent, but at the same time, they're also getting highly influenced by it.
This is a very good question. And I address part of this question in the last chapter of Soul and Sword. But this question that you just asked me, Sharan, is an entire project that I'm working on, which will be called Indo futurism, where I basically talk about, we think of technology as something new, right? But Indian civilization has always grappled with technology through its entire thousands of years of history. Let me give you a couple of examples. Actually, let me start from the contemporary point and then we'll go into the history, right? I write at the end of my book that in 2018 and 19, when people like me were talking about a new kind of welfareism that Prime Minister Narendra Modi was working on, many quote unquote free market walas, and I like the free market, I've even written a book on enterprise, but they refused to believe that he was working on his own version of welfareism, right? But I was always strident that this is true, and today, of course, everybody has started talking about it. If you read the annals of political Hinduism, if you read, and I write all of these things in Soul and Sword, if you read people like Dattopant Thengdi or Deen Dayal Upadhyay, what is Dattopant Thengdi saying? Dattopant Thengdi is saying, well, India has a unique voice in the world and a unique way of looking at life. Forget looking at governance, it has a unique way of looking at life. That unique way of looking at life does not harbor any extremism. Extremism is fundamentally, against the way India or Bharat looks at life itself. Therefore, we cannot, and it considers these two extremes, capitalism and communism. And he says that, look, none of these two, these are dogmas because they have an ism, right? These dogmas are not accurate for India. India must chart its own path. India must find what he calls a third way. This third way it must take into account Indian imagination. What is Indian imagination? Fundamentally, the idea of balance, right? That things must be in balance. You can go after profit, but that profit should not be that you leave your wife, you neglect your children, you destroy the family, you destroy the earth, you
Yeah.
destroy ecology, you pollute the rivers, you everybody dies.
Hmm.
That makes no sense. Nor can you go the other way where you destroy every bit of enterprise and put everybody into slave labor camps and say this is
Right.
collective future, right? India has a balanced third way. I think Prime Minister Narendra Modi is pioneering today. He's pioneering for many other reasons in the past, but today he's pioneering for one particular reason. He is one of the few leaders in the world who understands that because he has always been embracing of technology, never
Hmm.
refusing of technology, he understands that with AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning and all of these things, major disruption is already underway in the world, and more disruption will come in the future. What does disruption mean? In one sense, productivity will gallop, but in the other sense, there will be many people who might not have their traditional economic roles, right? Those people require support. And he is building, on one hand, he is building this major digital framework, right? To help productivity gallop. But he knows at the same time, in the transition period, the state will have to step forward and provide support so that the disruption is minimized. I think he has a very clear understanding of this.
Right.
And anybody who looks at India's large amounts of payments and subsidies, including in food and so on and so forth, should understand that this is almost, I was just saying somebody, this is almost India's version of charting out an entire picture where the kind of support that the most vulnerable people will be needed or must be provided to them, so that the economy can gallop using the latest technology and move forward. Again, you see in this entire picture being whole. It's not saying that we will leave aside technology, nor is it saying that we will only embrace technology and leave the people behind. It brings these together things together in a new kind of way, which I call digital
Right.
welfareism. Digital welfareism is a combination of using digital technology for productivity jumps, but also at the same time ensuring, depending what is required in a particular society, providing the kind of state support that are vital. Now, the free market wallas are really
Yeah.
against the state support. They will say that no, 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 this is terrible. The state can't do all
Mm.
these things. On the other hand, the socialists and the communists would say, what is all this digital disruption? I still remember one minister stood up in parliament and said, how can a farmer ever use,
Yeah.
UPI? How ridiculous does this sound today, right? So that is the other approach. You always shun anything that takes you further and gives you a technological jump. But I think Prime Minister Modi knows that neither of these two
Right.
extremes are the answer. There, the answer lies in between. There is a middle path. That middle path is critical, and I think that's what India is building. Now, let's go to the
Okay.
history for a second, Sharon. This is what has happened in India's history through and through. We still don't know how the Brihadashvara temple was built, right? We still don't know many of the architectural marvels that India has produced in the past. We don't know how they were done. We don't know how the wood steel in India was created. In Arabia, in Arab lands and former Ottoman lands, they are all very proud of Damascus steel. Damascus steel was the steel which created the sword of Saladin. In the Crusades, they spoke about the sword of Saladin meeting the cross of Richard,
Yeah.
cross and the sword of Richard Lionheart, right? So the sword of Saladin was made by Damascus steel. What was Damascus steel, Sharon? Damascus steel was not made in Damascus. The technology for Damascus steel came from India. That's why in Delhi, where I live, the Qutub Minar still does not rust, because we perfected a particular kind of steel making that we can't do even today, so that large things, including and small things like a sword, become almost indestructible, right? So we had a huge array of technology. When Prime Minister Modi spoke about plastic surgery, many silly people in India laughed, and even
Yeah.
still today laugh about this, but they are wrong. We know that rhinoplasty
Mm.
began in India, in southern India, where the skin from the nose is
Right.
grafted and so on and so forth. Rhinoplasty began in India. So we were always a technologically
Right.
advanced civilization. Now, because of various things, invasions, colonialism, this, that, and the other, our entire framework got destroyed, right? I think we are going back to a point where we are embracing technology, embracing the fact that our creativity and aesthetics always used to be global leaders and not global followers.
Naturally, because of the kind of mediums that we've created today, there are certain centers of mass media. It may be the movies, it may be OTT today, or different sort of digital content that we are producing. And it has a huge influence on not just the Indian audience, but also the global audience because of the reach that we've been able to gain over the years. Why I ask you this is because you brought up Indo-futurism, and if we look at the whole concept of Afrofuturism, it was so wonderfully portrayed in, say, movies like Black Panther. They know, strictly speaking, from a cinema studies perspective, do you think that we lack the cultural nitty-gritties to understand and portray perhaps the roots of India in a better manner? Because although there have been attempts, I'm not sure how many of them have been very successful. If you're talking about integrating technology using mass media to portray culture, it definitely cannot be in the form of Adi Purush. So you need to make it much better. So how do we achieve that? Where do you think is the root cause of all, I wouldn't say problems, but achieving a different outlook that perhaps India desperately craves today?
I've always maintained that Indian civilization and Indian history needs better historians and better storytellers. That is a fundamental problem we have had. Let me give you one small example. Somebody I really admire. When Uncle Pai, Uncle Pai was creating Amar Chitra Katha, he was taking that entire civilizational knowledge and making it
Absolutely.
accessible through the technology that was cutting edge at
Right.
his time, which is what was it? It was the
Yes.
comic book, right? Um, After Uncle Pi, I actually feel that after Uncle Pi, there has never been a real disruptive creative force retelling India's story in novel ways. He was the last big one. After that, there have been some people, this, that, and the other, but the really big mass impact, Uncle Pi was the last one who actually did this at scale, right? And India needs this. India needs better people, better storytellers, better historians to connect these dots for us, right? Otherwise, we will always be dependent on the West to tell our stories, and the West will never, they will either for prejudice or for lack of understanding, they will only tell the story the way they understand it. They'll never tell the story the way we understand it. So therefore, that's the core of the work of people like me. I mean, you look at the projects I'm doing next, right? I'm doing a big project on Ashtavakra Gita, which most Indians have never even
Mm.
heard of, right? I'm doing a major book on Indo futurism. I'm doing a major book on India as a civilizational state. I mean, all of these projects are aimed to really build a particular, understanding, deeper, richer understanding of India that I feel is very, very necessary. And I think unless that happens, and you mentioned Black Panther, that's a fantastic example. I hope one day one of us would be able to write down, deep research and then write down a story that can do for India what the Black Panther did for Africa. I think it's very important. China already had its moment in this, right?
Yeah.
Remember Crouching Tiger, what was it,
Yeah.
Hidden Dragon? So what is Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon? Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon came out when most of us was in school and stuff. But essentially, it was Chinese history and Chinese worldview through an epic fantasy adventure, which spoke about Chinese strengths, their sword wielding strengths, their magic, their all of that, right? We have not had that in India yet, and I think we are still waiting for that moment,
What would
Sharan.
you say are the top three takeaways from your book? Speak to your audience and why they need to perhaps purchase your book and why it's important to understand these things.
I think the first reason why I think most people should read Swollen Sword is because Swollen Sword explains for the first time the intellectual history, without prejudice, the intellectual history of India's current moment. How did we get here? How did we get to a point when somebody like Narendra Modi could win back to back full majority elections, right? How did we get to a point where technology and public infrastructure has become one of the biggest offerings of India to the world? None of this happened by chance. It happened because, of course, the dynamism of Narendra Modi, but also because of a long historical trajectory and intellectual history of an idea called political Hinduism, which I think, for the first time, in a sense, comprehensively has been demonstrated in my book Soul and Sword. The second reason I would think is to really understand the origin story, right? We're talking about comics and so on and so forth. What is the origin story? And people get deluded here, because I'll tell you why. And you would have heard these arguments before. If you talk about any great point in the story of political Hinduism, let's say the Vijayanagar kingdom, right? When Naipaul wrote about the Vijayanagar kingdom and its fall as a moment of great fall of Hindu civilization, immediately there were people who popped up and said, well, was Vijayanagar really Hindu or not? But they were taking and borrowing ideas from the Brahmani kingdoms, this, that, and the other. These are so therefore, these ideas, you will never get to a final point with that. How will I go back and prove whether Vijayanagar was really absolutely Hindu or not? I know, I believe that it was fundamentally a Hindu kingdom, but this academic debate can stretch on for the next 100 years, right? I actually bypass that completely. I say it doesn't matter. You can believe whatever you want to believe. At the end of the day, political Hinduism as an idea has a certain self narration. And you have to accept and embrace and respect that self narration. Political Hinduism as an idea clearly believes that Vijayanagar was a moment. It represented the fall, in a sense, of the south and the southern bastion, which was being held up against the onslaught of Islam by the Vijayanagar rulers. This you cannot take away. You cannot say, why do you believe that? They believe that because they believe that, right? So therefore the self narration is a very
Yeah,
important argument. To bypass this eternal argument that, how Hindu was
yeah.
Shivaji, a ridiculous argument,
Because he had
completely
so and so
ridiculous
Muslim
argument.
generals in his army.
Yeah, because it's also, and I say this in the book, right? I say this in the very beginning of the book. So Shivaji said Hindwa vi Swarajya. Shivaji also
Yeah,
had Muslim generals. I will say Shivaji saw himself as a Hindu king that, who fought against the imperialism of what he saw, as an oppressive, Muslim rule,
absolutely.
so to speak, right? Somebody else will say, no, 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 these were just kings fighting with
Yeah,
each other. And look, he took Muslim generals. I will say, well, he took Muslim generals because that you take people from the
yeah,
society around you. The best talent from the society around you, you take, right? So this is an endless debate. I very clearly say we don't have to have
yeah.
this debate anymore. We have to say, in the process of the historical idea of political Hinduism, is Shivaji Maharaj a
Right.
seminal figure? And he is. Why? Vivekananda is referring to Shivaji, right? Every major figure is referring back to Shivaji and holding up Shivaji Maharaj
Oh,
as a
you're speaking
seminal
about
figure. If they are referring back to Shivaji and holding up Shivaji Maharaj as a seminal figure, then you cannot come and argue that
yeah.
no, 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 he's not important. He is important because he's
But
important
perhaps
in the
that
narrative,
debate is ever
right?
growing because if you look at it, it's not just restricted to historical figures such as Krishna Devaraya or Shivaji. Even today, there is a debate about who is a good Muslim and why is he a good Muslim. Right? There are questions about Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam that I saw on Twitter a couple of days ago. If you've come across that, there are questions about Arif Muhammad Khan. There are questions about almost everybody who supports a certain cause or has a certain inclination. But what I would ask is, since you told me that you're also drawing certain chapters from the past where you're looking into the underpinnings of the Hindu thought and you're looking at philosophers, you're looking at thought leaders, when you look at it contemporarily, and you did bring up certain names like Narendra Modi, who've been perhaps uh, very pivotal to how modern Hinduism is perhaps influenced in the country. A lot of them personally are not intellectuals themselves today. If you look at it, maybe you can argue that, say, a Vajpayee ji was a poet because he used to write, but perhaps that cannot be said about certain figures. So, how do you make sense of this? Or would you say that these people have been patrons to a certain thought?
No, look, I paint a full picture, right? I Once I get into the story of political Hinduism, the story of a intellectual idea historically cannot be made up only by ideologues or thinkers, right? There has to be many other kinds of people. There has to be politicians, there has to be, professionals, there has to be generals who fight armies, there has to be all kinds of people, right? And there's obviously a large range of people that populate this universe of political Hindu. I also make the point that, look, there will always be, and some people will point out and say, oh look, but this set of people were violent at one point, right? Sure, because remember, every political ideology will have its, luminaries, will have its intellectuals, will have its pioneering thought leaders, will have its pioneering politicians, who will also have an underbelly. And I mentioned that there would be characters that
Yeah.
infest its underbelly also, because as remember, like any thought, a political ideology exists in the world. The world is made up of human beings. Human beings are imperfect. So, how can any political ideology, or in fact, how can any ideology be perfect? It's not possible. Can it only be made up of people who are perfect? That's just not possible. It's like saying, oh, so many people believe in this faith and that faith, but there are so many, crooks in that faith also. Sure, because again, the faith may have a particular point of view, but human beings practice that faith, and human beings are flawed, they're imperfect, so their behavior sometimes will be imperfect, right? So that entire universe is populated by this dramatis personae, so to speak, Sharan, right? And I don't think we should necessarily only zero in on the intellectuals and thinkers, because at the end of the day, if it was just left to the intellectuals and thinkers, if Aurobindo gave his great Uttarpada speech, which I mentioned in my book, and then goes away to Pondicherry and for years in between doesn't even talk to
Yeah.
too many people or anybody for that matter, right? How would this ideology grow? It obviously required, other people like a Savarkar,
Mm.
like, later on the RSS, Hegdewar, and all these people who proceeded to build the arms
Right.
and legs of the thought, right? Who proceeded to, in a sense, collectivize people on the basis of that thought. So that's also equally important, because remember, political ideology also, certainly beyond thought and I sort of a sense of philosophy and so on and so forth, it also is concerned
Right.
with power. You cannot deny that a political ideology beyond a point can only thrive if it has access to power. Otherwise, it's just
Yeah.
philosophy lying in one corner, right? It is only when it taps into power that it gets scale, to use an entrepreneurial word. That scale only comes with the access to power. And therefore, people who will bring that access to power are also very
You
important.
explained, you began by explaining what is soul, and you've concluded by explaining what is sword. So, thank you so much for that glorious explanation of what the book actually contains. Any parting thoughts, Dr. Sengupta?
Well, I mean, I think as far as my work is concerned, Sharon, and I think also the India's going through a phase of a new kind of adventure of the mind, so to speak, where Indians, and this always happens, I mean, when people are very poor, they cannot think. It's the Maslow's hierarchy principle, right? I mean, when you're poor, you don't think of anything but your basics. I think Indians are progressing in a direction where they're beginning to reimagine who they are, where they come from, and only when you ask those two questions can you ask the third most important question: where are you going? When I published Being Hindu in 2014-15, a lot of people told me that, oh, these kind of books are nobody's interested in, so on and so forth. And now and I know the trajectory that Being Hindu had. And I used to tell my publishers then, this is an inflection point in India's history. India is going to go through an entire process where Indians will reimagine who they are. And people get very stuck to one political party or one leader kind of conversation, right? And I say that this is much bigger. It's a society wide change, which for us means 1.4 billion people. And that has an incredible energy and churn of its own. And I think that's what's happening in India. And as we go further, Sharan, you will see that this will have all kinds of manifestations, including an Indian Black Panther, perhaps one day. But on a serious note, I think this kind of churn, Hinduism, I always tell my audiences that there are only three questions worth asking and answering in Hinduism, right? In Hindu thought. Who am I? Who am I? What do I want? And what is my purpose? These are the only three important questions of Hinduism. Now, if you look at political Hinduism, there's a slight change. The questions are who am I? What do I want? And where am I going? Right? And I think Indians are going through an entire churn where
Yeah.
people are asking and answering for themselves in an indigenous sort of way. You might say that nothing is truly indigenous, which is true, but as far as indigenousness is
Mm.
possible, people are asking themselves, who am I really? Am I that jeans that I wear? Am I that car that I travel in? Am I that, phone that I buy? Or is there something deeply more intrinsic that that is what makes me Indian, that makes me Bharatiya? So they're asking, who am I? Therefore, what do I want? Okay, so if I come from this core that makes me Bharatiya, what do I want? And then they're answering all kinds of
Yeah.
questions about what they really want, and that is what is giving them direction. Where am I going? Right? That is what I think is very, very critical. That's why my book is not a book only about history. It is an intrinsic book for the future, because I think Indians are now asking, okay, so now I'm beginning to understand who am I. I'm beginning to understand what do I really want as a Bharatiya. Where am I really going? And that journey of where we are going is going to be really, really exciting. And I think we are entering in a very exciting period, and therefore I'm excited about the work I'm going to do next. And I think India will go through a very
It
exciting
certainly will.
phase.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Sengupta. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Sharan. I appreciate your
Thank you.
time. Thank you very
Viewers,
much.
Dr. Sengupta's book is available online and in bookshops across the country. It's called Soul and Sword, and it's published by Penguin Random House, India. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any thoughts or questions to Dr. Sengupta, I'm sure he'd love to take them in the comment section.